Assalamu alaikum, shalom aleichem, pax vobiscum. Welcome everyone. Glad you're here on this important evening. I'm the Reverend Dr. David D. Grafton, Professor of Islamic Studies and Christian Muslim Relations, and Director of the Duncan Black Macdonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian Muslim Relations here at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being online wherever you are in the world for this biennial Bijlefeld Lecture. The Willem Bijlefeld Lecture, which was begun in 1990, is named after a former dean of Hartford Seminary and the first director of the Macdonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian Muslim Relations. The lecture series brings a distinguished scholar to campus for a public presentation on Islam or Christian Muslim relations to promote interreligious understanding and mutual respect in local, national, and international communities. And our scholar for the 2025 Bijlefeld Lecture is the eminent Professor of Islamic Studies, Emeritus, Professor Richard Bulliet of Columbia University, who will be introduced formally by Professor Hossein Kamali in a moment. But first, I would like to introduce our Dean, Dr. Dina Grant, Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs, and Associate Professor of Jewish Studies, to bring a welcome. Dean Grant.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. Dr. Kamali will be introducing Dr. Bulliet in a moment, but I wanted to make sure I had an opportunity to express my appreciation for you joining us and to Dr. Bulliet for presenting to us tonight. I was going to tell you a little bit about the series, so David did that. But when I did look, it said it started in 1989. So I wonder, you just said 1990. We've got to check again. So I just want to say the lecture series, which was honoring the world-renowned Dr. Willem Bijlefeld, was in honor of his directorship of the Duncan Black Macdonald and his work in Christian Muslim relations. And we honor him by continuing to advance this work by inviting eminent scholars to talk about Muslim-Christian relations and increase interreligious understanding. And many esteemed professors have talked to us, and we have tonight one as well. And so I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kamali to tell us a bit more.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean Grant. Greetings, everyone. Students, our dean, our board members, all my colleagues at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. I also greet and welcome those who are present here, everyone, as well as those who are joining us online. And I also want to thank the director of the Duncan Black Macdonald Center for Christian Muslim Understanding, the Reverend Dr. David D. Grafton, who continues this tradition of holding biannual lectures in honor of Willem Bijlefeld. I want to take a moment to introduce our postdoc, Dr. Noor Zaidi, who has joined HIU this year. It's a great pleasure and honor to have her as a scholar of Shia studies, and she is working on completing a manuscript and as well as other works that she does. A very warm welcome as well to our guests of honor, Professor Richard W. Bulliet and Professor Greta Ehrman. It is a privilege and a pleasure to introduce Professor Bulliet as the speaker of this year's Bijlefeld Lecture. Currently, Emeritus Professor of History at Columbia University, Professor Bulliet is widely respected for his enduring scholarship on Islamic history and for his discerning insights into the broader patterns of world history. Of particular relevance to this evening's lecture are his sustained and original efforts to deepen our understanding of the historical relationships between Islam and Christianity. His thoughtful monograph, The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization, 2006, set forth the view that these two faith traditions share centuries of intertwined experience, histories of exchange, adaptation, and parallel development. Rejecting the divisive rhetoric of clash and conflict, he invited readers to see religious history in more connected and human terms. Published nearly 20 years ago, as I said, in early 2006. The timeliness of that work has only grown more apparent. Long before and since, Professor Bulliet has brought to his writing a distinctive combination of meticulous scholarship and interpretive imagination. His early books, The Patricians of Nishapur, 1971, and Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period, 1977, remain foundational studies in Islamic social and religious history. I'm very glad to report that in our first year PhD seminar that Professor Grafton and myself teach, this is going to be one of the readings during this semester. We talk about the methodology, the innovative methodology of this work. Professor Bulliet's other book, Islam, The View from the Edge, 1994, opened new perspectives on Muslim societies beyond the central structures of caliphal power, illuminating the diversity and vitality that have long characterized Muslim societies. It would be impossible, of course, to do full justice, to do any kind of justice here to the breadth of Professor Bulliet's work. I have a few books here for show and tell. I will only mention his recent memoir, Methodists and Muslims, 2020, which offers a more personal reflection on his intellectual and spiritual journey. From the small Midwestern town, Rockford, Illinois, to a lifetime of engagement with history, ideas, and cross-cultural social formations, written with candor and quiet humor. Strong characteristic, strong quality. It's a meditation on curiosity, empathy, and the possibilities of learning across boundaries. Professor Bulliet's work exemplifies the spirit of the Bijlefeld Lectures, dedicated to advancing interreligious understanding and to scholarship that helps reach beyond low-hanging fruits. As a member of the Hartford faculty and of the Duncan Black Macdonald Center, I am honored to welcome to the podium Professor Richard Bulliet. Thank you.
Start with a couple of caveats. One is that for the last 25 years, I've had a chronic cough. And so if I break out in coughing, don't be alarmed. I can suppress it usually. Secondly, I'm older than either President Biden or President Trump. And since we've become accustomed to attributing mental feebleness to both gentlemen, I don't feel that I need to stress that I might not get things right. So, that being said, I also want to say to David Grafton that I think the two most important scholars when I got into dealing with Islam that I encountered were Ignaz Goldziher, who writing on Islamic law and theology, which I thought was a brilliant synthesis, and I've come to believe eventually that it was wrong in a number of ways. But it was so well done, considering particularly the state of the literature that he was able to read at that time. And the other one was Duncan Black Macdonald. I think that he has been sadly neglected by the field in general, but his religious attitude and life in Islam, I think, was a extraordinary book that got away from the sort of textualism that you found in Goldziher and others of his era, and got into aspects of Islam as experienced by Muslims that was not hidebound according to theological debates or legal debates or things like that. And I think that to maintain his importance in the field is a very important charge that you have, and I'm happy to see that you are taking it up. Now, I have spent quite a few decades now dealing with Islamic topics, but also dealing with animals, particularly camels and donkeys, of which I am, I think, probably the world's foremost expert on the history of camel saddles. I don't actually believe there is anyone else who has ever written much about the history of camel saddles. But I also, donkey saddles are less interesting, but other aspects of donkeys are important. And I've been very interested in transportation and very interested in world history. If you wish, you can go to YouTube and look me up, and you'll find that I have about 50 lectures on world history online, and you can find out what my views are on world history. I don't remember what I said in those lectures. My first wife was dying at the time, and I was caring for her, and I would simply go off twice a week and stand in front of a crowd and make stuff up. And but the first lecture now has about 860,000 hits, so it seems to still entertain. The question I'm starting with here, and you might look at that sequence of questions and realize that they don't fit in any obvious way with one another. But it really starts with the question that has always interested me, is why in Christianity the establishment of the canon for the Bible and determining what is in or outside the canon, so that you have the apocryphal New Testament that has many writings that are not included in the Bible. And there are some included in the Bible that even today people will debate whether or not all those books belong in the Bible.
Next.
I don't think so.
No.
But if you deal with Islam, the question of a canon arises early in terms of the text of the Quran, but it then arises some 600 years later in terms of the canonical books of Hadith, the Kitab al-Sahih. The question that I've pondered is why, if you have two religious founders who were both historical individuals, and I believe probably everyone in this room would agree that the evidence is that there was a historical Muhammad and there was a historical Jesus. And if you wanted to know the deeds and words and life of the historical Jesus, you go to the Gospels. And the book of Acts, I suppose, is a continuation of the Gospels. And you see what is written. But the number of people involved in authoring is very limited. I mean, supposedly the 12 disciples are where it emanates from, but there are more than 12 people at the Sermon on the Mount. And you wonder why didn't someone do a survey and sort of go to people and say, what did you think of our Lord Jesus, who just said this and said that? But nobody was collecting that lore, or more properly, we do not have the lore that was collected that was not filtered through the legitimizing status of the disciples. On the other hand, for Muhammad, the historical Muhammad, people did go to people who knew him or claimed to know him. And there were scores of these people, if not hundreds of these people. And when you read the scholarship on who were the people who provided lore about the prophet, you'll find that there were people who claimed to be 100 years old, and I was the last one to know the prophet. Well, maybe you saw him when you were 3 years old once, but people would kind of, ask to be taken out to lunch on the basis of their acquaintance with the prophet, and whether they could provide a hadith, a tiny narrative of some aspect of what the prophet did or what he said or what his closest companions did or said in his presence or about him, and collecting these bits of lore, which could have been done for Jesus, wasn't done for Jesus, but it was done for Muhammad. And I always thought, why was that? I don't believe that when Jesus was crucified, he only had 12 friends, and they were all disciples. I mean, I believe that there must have been a huge number of people who felt that loss to the community as a sort of a ground-shaking event. But then you go and you look at Muhammad and you find that it's considered legitimate to recite a hadith by someone who only saw the prophet once or knew very little about him. And so I've wondered why did they collect the hadith of the prophet but not collect the hadith of Jesus? Once I started wondering about that, I became more aware of the fact that the collection of hadith was not seamless, that you have areas that do collect hadith and areas that don't collect hadith. And it's rather interesting that when you look at North Africa and Spain, you have one person, Malik ibn Anas, who produced a text, the Bulliet, that is taken as the basis of Islamic law throughout North Africa and Spain and large parts of Egypt. And that is based upon things that were heard from or about the companions of the Prophet by a man who lived mostly in Medina, where Muhammad passed his last years. Well, it turns out that there's a report that sometime probably in the 760s, that is to say, a century, and more after the death of the Prophet, the Caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate, al-Mansur, a very powerful man, one guy who built Baghdad and really established the Abbasid Caliphate, he supposedly said to Malik ibn Anas, I want to send your book out to everyone for them to use it as the basis of how they look upon Islam as a system for living, not narrowly as a law code, but as a system of living. And Malik is reported to have replied to al-Mansur. He said, don't do it, for people have already heard different positions, heard hadith, and related narrations. Every group has taken whatever came to them and put it into practice, conforming to it while other people differed. To take them away from what they have been professing will cause a disaster. Therefore, leave people with whatever school they follow and whatever the people of each country choose for themselves. So the person who was seen by so many Muslims as the source for applying the collected sayings of the Prophet and deeds of the Prophet into a legal system and a system for living. That person said, don't impose my view on other people, because other people will have their own views. And what he says is absolutely correct, that when a community following hadith came to the notion of we know who and what who the Prophet was and what he stood for, it would be very hard to change that. I once was working on the city of Gorgan in Iran, which has a text that is preserved consisting of 1,000 or so capsule biographies of religious scholars from or living in the city of Gorgan, which is up at the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea. And when you read in detail what each of these people says, it's very clear that there was one person in Gorgan who was enormously admired and recited many, many hadith about fasting, about not just fasting during Ramadan, but fasting all the time. I mean, he really went overboard and saying, and then the Prophet said we should fast during Muharram, we should fast during this and that. And clearly he was sort of a nut on the issue of fasting, which, in the Christian tradition, of course, we know there were people who also were obsessed with fasting. But ultimately, his views were rejected in the 6 books of legitimate hadith, or hadith considered to be canonical by, say, the year 1300. And we don't hear of his supererogatory fasting after that. But for the people in Gorgan, for them to be told, for someone in Gorgan, he's growing up and he's listening to the scholars of his town, the most admirable spokesman for Islam in his city, and they're telling him he should fast and do these special fasts for different purposes. And then he finds that other Muslims don't do it. And the rejection, I think, must have had a very powerful impact on people. To hear that the people you have admired most, because they're telling the stories that Muhammad spawned, either by example or by words, to suddenly be told that these people are liars, or that their stuff isn't authentic. As scholars now, we look back at major figures, intellectual figures, who went through the hadith that were collected and rejected most of them and said, well, that's a good story, but we don't think it's true. For example, see what I have up here. Yeah. For example, the very first line. No, it isn't the first line. oh no, it's the first line of the last slide. It was this business of seek knowledge even unto China. Probably the best known hadith relating to traveling in quest of knowledge that you have in Islam. And it's not included in the 6 books of sound hadith, but people recite it anyway. They really don't want to, seek knowledge even unto China. What do you think? That's supposed to be such a wonderful thought. But what sort of thought is that? Why, if you were a Muslim or you're becoming a Muslim, would someone be telling you to go to China and seek knowledge there? There's no knowledge of Islam in China. Well, partly it's at the word ilm for knowledge. In most biennial texts of this sort are being used, meaning the science of religion. The sciences of religion, the Orluminti. But you're not going to find that out in China. So people say, well, that's a secular sort of hadith, and it's not sahih. And yet, the one that it's linked with, that says Muslims should seek knowledge, that's considered sahih, just not the unto China part of it. So what you have is an institution known as Rihla fi Talab al-Hadith, travel for the quest of knowledge, or for the quest of hadith. Rihla, meaning travel. Rihla is an interesting word. I've never seen anyone talk about it very much. The word never occurs in the Quran. There are 4 verses that use the same root. 3, I think, of the 4 relate to saddlebags. And the 4th one is a very general one, has nothing to do with searching for hadith. But the word rihla and its root meaning means a camel saddle. And the idea that you would travel by camel to search for hadith is sort of built into the phraseology. That there are a number of the hadith given in Khatib al-Baghdadi's book on travel in search of hadith that specifically say, oh, I heard there was a hadith, so I bought a camel and I went there and I asked so-and-so what the hadith was. Now, I think that is a very important broad determination of what I'm going to get at the end of this talk, inshallah. Because the travel that is done when you are dealing with the early Islamic centuries is almost all done overland. And overland means either a donkey or a camel or walking. The rate at which people did this then, right down to the 19th century, was by and large 20 miles a day. So if you wanted to go from, say, Samarkand out in Central Asia to Mecca, that's well over 1,000 miles. You're going to be on the road, literally on the road, walking or riding an animal for well over 2 months. And people are urged to do this to collect one hadith. You have one of these anecdotes that Khatib al-Baghdadi contains in his book on traveling in search of hadith. Talks about a man asking his father, should I study with someone here in town, or should I travel? His father says, you should travel. You have people in very obscure places who become magnets for students coming to study with them. My favorite is a man who lived in a village in Uzbekistan, who had heard the Sahih of al-Bukhari recited by one of Bukhari's students. And he lived in a village called Kushmayhan. And so he was known as al-Kushmayhani. We know of dozens and dozens of people who traveled to the village of Kushmayhan in Uzbekistan in order to hear him recite the Sahih al-Bukhari. Most of those people, if they had stayed home, could have heard someone local recite the Sahih al-Bukhari. But then they would have had an additional step between themselves and the Prophet, because when you transmitted a hadith, you gave the chain of reciters going back to the Prophet or to whoever originates the hadith. And you recite that, and then you give the text of the hadith. Now, not only that, when you look at books like Edible Imla by Sam'ani, where it talks about the edeb, the manners of reciting the hadith of the Prophet, it's very clear that he says, well, you put on a new white garment. You do your ablutions. You comb your hair. Maybe you put a henna in your beard or some scent or something. So that when you present yourself to your class, you are there in the guise of Muhammad. You aren't saying that, but all of the examples of behavior that Sam'ani gives have to do with how did the Prophet do it. Like, you say, well, you should look in a mirror and see whether you look okay. And then he'll say, well, because here's this hadith of the Prophet, where every time the Prophet would go to meet someone at the gate of the compound he lived in, he would stop on the way and look in the vessel that had water for the animals and see his reflection, because you should look nice. And I think that for young people, and hadith was taught to children starting usually around 7 or 8 years old, and lasting up, in many cases, say up until marriageable age, 18, say. So hadith education was almost exactly overlapped elementary and high school in our notions. This was what you heard from the most admirable people in your community about what Islam was and how you as a Muslim should act. And so when you heard this person reciting hadith, in a sense, you heard the chain linking him to the Prophet. And a bit of that charisma comes through the chain, and the chain is essential. And the longer the chain, the weaker it gets, because everyone knows that when you recite something, transmit it to the next person, the next person, the next person. Ultimately, it begins to be corrupted. So the scholarship was devoted to finding the least corrupted chains of authority and granting a priority to those hadith that had the most reliable chains. Now, traveling for religious purposes in Christianity largely consisted of going on pilgrimage, preferably to the Middle East, but eventually to places like Compostela in northwest Spain. But really it was Jerusalem, Rome, Constantinople, Ephesus, places like that. So you had pilgrimage, and then in Islam you had the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. You also had pilgrimages to local shrines in both Islam and Christianity. The one we know best is the Shrine at Canterbury. And you think of all the things that happened and are talked about on that pilgrimage to Canterbury. You realize that they only went 200 miles or less. What if you went 1,000 miles? You know, boy, the number of stories Chaucer could have stuffed in there if he'd had that long a trip. But the fact of the matter is that we have very little evidence of what travel on a long caravan was like. We don't know, for example, we know that caravans would have people of different nationalities speaking different languages. Obviously, the pilgrimage caravans of later times were full of Muslims from an increasingly diverse geography of the Islamic world. But even for shorter pilgrimages or shorter travels, we don't know very much what it was like. We believe, for example, that the Jewish merchants hung out with each other, and they created letters back and forth written in the Hebrew script so that they could be only read by fellow Jews. And this is what Shlomo Dov Goitein devoted much of his life to writing about, writing and consulting the Geniza documents from Cairo, the Jewish community of Cairo. We think that the Armenian merchants hung out with each other, and that they would eat together probably. They would speak Armenian. They would use the Armenian alphabet. Well, what did the Muslims do? There already were a lot of caravan merchants who were Arabs before the Prophet, because the Prophet himself is regarded as being a caravan merchant prior to the first revelation of the Quran. Did the Muslims who became, did the Arabs who became Muslims, when they traveled on a caravan with Arabs who were Jews or Christians or pagans, did they hang out with them, or did they hang out with each other? Some of these things you can sort of zero in on because you have dietary things, but who do you eat with? Very important thing throughout history in all communities is who eats with whom and what do they eat? Because there are a lot of dietary rules, but the dietary rules will vary with what religion you have. Presumably, according to people who try and study trade, the desire was that affinity groups, people from the same city or followers of the same faith, would have a division of trade in which they shared information and economic dealings with one another rather than with people from other affinity groups. So when Islam starts out, do you have Muslim traders? And how do you account for Muslim traders? I mean, we know that you had some, and in fact, one of the most important early figures in Islam from the time immediately following the death of the Prophet, but even during the Prophet's own lifetime, was a very close friend of his named Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Abdurrahman ibn Auf was one of the members of the Shura that selected Uthman instead of Ali as the third caliph. And Abdurrahman ibn Auf was highly esteemed by everyone and considered a great source and a very close friend of the Prophet. And what he's known for is being rich. He never held an office. He never sought any political power. He never sought money per se. Indeed, the story is that when somebody said, well, you want to start trading, I'll give you some sort of trade goods that you can go to the market and you can buy and sell. And Abdurrahman said, no, I'll just go to the market and make my own way. I'll buy and sell. But one of the things that he was known for was during the period of the conquest, he was entrusted on at least one occasion with transmitting the loot, the stuff captured from the battle, transmitting it from the battlefield to the head of government, to the caliph. Now, we don't talk very much about this question of after a battle, what happens to the stuff. We know that the stuff that consists of real estate was called fight, and that became the property, captured property became, real estate became the property of the central government, of the caliphate. But then there was another type of stuff, and that was called a ghanima, which meant booty or loot. But that consisted of slaves, movable property, livestock, weapons, armor, almost anything that would have been in the camp of a defeated army comes into the hands of the Muslim army. And they divide it up among all the soldiers. Well, so now you're on a campaign, you've just fought a battle, you're on the winning side, you didn't get killed in the battle, and now you own 2 goats, a 7-year-old slave boy, and a really nice bronze breastplate and helmet. But now you have to go off to the next battlefield. What do you do with your stuff? Well, along come merchants. They say, and they're going to be Muslim merchants because this is an Islamic battle. And they say, look, I'll give you cash money for your goats and your slave boy and your bronze breastplate and helmet. And that person is modeled on Abdurrahman ibn Auf. And I've tried to think of, is there any other religion that has as much esteem for a man simply for being an honest businessman as the Muslim tradition has for Abdurrahman ibn Auf? Usually you say, well, businessmen are crooks, or they're never going to get into heaven, or they're grinding the faces of the poor or something. But this is a man who simply did business and was celebrated for that. Well, I think he's a model. I think he's a very important figure for early Islam as modeling what this new world of ambulatory Muslim communities is going to be like. Now, let me proceed on and see what the world's at. Can't remember what I put on this. Yeah, these are just examples of stories from Khatib al-Baghdadi, a man who died at the end of the 11th century. And these are things that he collected as stories about looking for hadith. I know the tradition is that when you use this kind of display, that I turn around and I look at it and I read it aloud. I'm not going to read that aloud. You can read it for yourself. But it's important to realize that this book by Khatib al-Baghdadi is really about how important it is to travel in search of hadith. Now, you could say, well, in Christianity, well, isn't it important to do a pilgrimage? Well, not as important, because in the first place, you didn't do a pilgrimage to go and talk to someone. You went there to be in a sacred place, to experience it, to imagine it, and maybe to bring back the finger bone of Saint Aloysius or the metatarsal of Saint Oliverius. Souvenirs. The number of Palestine gardens in America that were set up by Protestant missionaries who went and brought back all the plants they found in Jerusalem. You went to a place to experience something of a soulful nature in that place. But in Islam, you went to a place to hear something that would stir your soul. But the places were continually changing, because the people who recited the hadith of the Prophet were dying. And you wanted to get the shortest possible linkage between you and the Prophet. And you hoped that you got to Baghdad or Basra, or wherever you went, before the guy died. But you didn't know where to go, because some story of the Prophet could be anywhere. So you had people who were making this rihla, and they would be literally years on the road. Now, you'd say you travel from Samarkand to Baghdad, then you spend a couple of years in Baghdad, then you go to Mecca and you spend a time there, then you go to this, that, and you don't get back for maybe 5 or 6 years. And your family, they grew up without you around, other family members, or you have very important consideration for Muslim travelers, where you went, you married a new wife. So you could have 4 wives, but they would not really be in the same places. This was drummed into me when I was visiting in a prosperous Shiite family in Kuwait. They said, well, you should marry someone here. I said, well, I'm happily married at home. I said, no, I know, but of course you're happily married, but you can have a wife here. This would be a normal thing to do. And the Christians didn't fall for that, but it was an idea. So there's this question: do you listen to the hadith recited at home by people in town, or do you listen to the hadith that you find as you travel around the Muslim world? And the argument seems to be that there is greater admiration of the person who traveled than the person who simply studied at home. Now, obviously, the collections of hadith had to be written down. Sure, you could remember hadith. Could you remember 5,000 or 20,000? And some people probably could. But by and large, we know this because sometimes you'll hear about the funeral of someone and say, well, 1,000 ink pots were broken as a salute to the dead person. Well, obviously, the 1,000 ink pots, because 1,000 students were writing down what the teacher said. Or not even necessarily what the teacher said, because the teacher would employ a mustemlet, and the teacher would say, I heard from Abu Abdullah and Abu Abdullah. And the Mustamlik would say, I heard from Abu Abdullah. He'd be the repetiteur, because in a large class, it's only the people in the front row who can hear Professor so-and-so, Professor so-and-so. So you have a repetiteur in the class. And that person ultimately remembers everything that that the person he's working for recites. But that written version, when the person dies, that written version usually ends up in a cabinet at the mosque, and nobody reads it, because what you learn from reading doesn't count in terms of your being esteemed as a scholar. You had to have the chain of authority. It's easy to imagine, say, someone with an eidetic memory, that they can know all the hadith and be regarded as an idiot because they never had any chain of authority. They never heard it. All right. You have the local shrines, you have the pilgrimage sites, and Islam uniquely has this quest for the word of the Prophet transmitted in a highly stylized, regulated format, and that validated that person as a reciter for future occasions. This is a chart showing, or a graph, not a graph, a table, showing where the scholars came from in different time periods. And I'm only comparing two columns here. I'm comparing, one is Iran, and the other is Egypt and Syria combined. And what is very clear is that Iran goes from negligible representation to being the largest sharer in the number of people devoting themselves to travel and scholarship. Egypt and Syria never gets over 20% or 15 to 20% until you get down after the Mongol invasion, and you get down and it goes up to 70% or so. So you have a huge shift at a certain point between Iran, with a vastly growing share of hadith reciters or hadith questers, and Egypt and Syria, that really only become important, Damascus and Cairo and Aleppo, only become important after the Mongols have taken over all the eastern areas. So there's this question of why the eastern areas? And as I see, I should get to greater things if I want to. Okay. This is an original drawing by a renowned scholar of geography and pencil drawing. This is sort of the Cy Twombly of Hadith studies, just scribbled. There is in a book I published a couple of years ago called Exploring Animal Energy in the Arid Zone, I have well-done versions of this that were done by a group of people in South America. But I just scribbled this out. And what I'm trying to show here is that you can't have trade carried on by camel caravans if you don't have any camels. And at the time of the rise of Islam, you had camels in North Africa, north of the Sahara. You had camels in North Africa, south of the Sahara. You had camels in the Arab Mashriq, going up to the border of Turkey and down through the Arabian Peninsula. But you didn't have any one-up camels in Iran. And the Arab tribes did not relocate into Iran. You did have Arab armies coming into Iran and bringing large numbers of camels. But but they weren't breeding the animals. And you need colossal numbers to have a caravan trade covering the enormous extent of Islam. And if I'd done the next drawing, it would have shown that Afghanistan and Pakistan and northern India were in the next phase of expansion of camel breeding. So we know that camel breeding extended just phenomenally, added about 5 million square miles after the rise of Islam. And very largely Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India become highly productive of camels used for the caravan trade, and of the people who rear the camels, raise the camels. But they're not Arabs. Some are, but most of them are. You have Baluch, you have Kurds, you have Brahouis, you have Pashtuns. Lots of people are suddenly adopting camel breeding. Why are they doing this? Well, because it's part of the growth of trade. If you cannot have a caravan trade without nomads who are living in the desert and raising the camels, because the cost of raising camels for the first 4 to 5 years before you put them to work, if you have to feed them for 4 or 5 years, the economic advantage disappears unless they're eating worthless food, and that's the desert. So the desert and the camel breeding go together, not simply because it's the preferred climate of the camels, but because the nomads in the desert are willing to accept the privations of desert life because they love their animals. And they raise the animals, and then they sell the animals or rent the animals to the caravan organizers, about whom we know virtually nothing. Now, how did this happen? And this is the final thing I want to get into. I should say that, there are no domestic elephants. Elephants are always raised in the wild, or breed in the wild. They live in the wild. And because they become useful for labor at the age of 12. And who wants to feed an elephant for 12 years in order to get him to carry logs from the lumber mill down to the seashore? So this question of how long you have to care for the animals is important. The caravan system that arises, that eventually stretches from Morocco to northern China, over time becomes almost completely dominated in its organizational forms by Muslims. Islam doesn't say you should have caravans, but as a matter of fact, they're the people who organize the caravans, and yet the caravans had merchants traveling with them from many, many different nationalities. But the business side of it, the organization of it, was primarily with the Muslims. We don't exactly know why this is, but I would suggest that you think of it in terms of someone's converting to Islam. You're trying to persuade them. As a Muslim, you will fast, you will pray, you will pay alms. Once during your lifetime, you will travel to Mecca, and you must realize that there's no way to get to Mecca that doesn't mean at least 20 days riding a camel. Not many people are going to be saying, oh, I get to ride a camel for 20 days, or I get to walk across Arabia for 20 days. That's not a selling point. But if you say the most admirable people as Muslims are those who have traveled to collect stories of the Prophet, That's an appeal. And you had thousands of young people, really, who traveled with their uncles or their fathers, who would go and search for hadith and then become acculturated into the life of the caravan, about which we know so little. And I think that that there was a actual effort to recruit people on the basis of rihla fi talab al-hadith, that you wanted Muslims to take it as a given that being a Muslim means you travel. The second thing, being a Muslim means you travel and you're literate. And you're literate in Arabic, because hadith are always transmitted in Arabic, no matter what your home language is. And I think, and I've expounded on this in the book I mentioned on exploring animal energy in the Arab zone, I think that the first generation after the Prophet made it an actual effort to go against the notion of a fixed body of hadith and foster the notion of traveling for hadith, because they're partly selling the idea of camel commerce, as opposed to the pre-Islamic commerce, which is overwhelmingly by sea or by river. The great transition in Islam economically is that the commercial world of Greece and Rome and late antiquity shifts from being waterborne to being overland. And overland is very, for the Middle Eastern parts of the area, it's very important that overland means east and west and not north and south. The rivers run north and south, where there are rivers like the Tigris, Euphrates, the Nile. But the overland trade routes are going east and west. And there's almost no possibility of commerce. And this means you also are changing the cargo that you carry. And if you're traveling by water, the overwhelming thing that you carried was wine. That was the highest value thing. I think that the Muslim prohibition on wine is primarily a commercial effort to reduce the appeal of shipping wine because you can't really carry wine by camel. I mean, it's just not a good idea, because you have to take it off. You have leaks coming in skins. You have breakage of caskets. In fact, by the time Islam arises, the wine trade is almost entirely being carried in barrels. And one of the odd things about the Middle Eastern world of medieval time is that there are no barrels. There are no barrel makers. There's no word for a barrel maker. That was something that was picked up from the Germans. Finally, one last thing, I think. Yes. This is a map of northeastern Iran. It shows there's a city you see route number 5 shows a caravan route that goes north of the mountains. And route number 4, which is at the bottom, is a caravan route, a shorter one, that goes through the desert south of the mountains. City of Gorgan on the left is a terminus for the northern route. And Nishapur on the lower right is a terminus for the southern route, although the trade from Nishapur goes to Gorgan. Now, I looked at the biographical materials for these two cities, and I found that travelers from Gorgan, 50% of them went to Egypt and Syria. Travelers from Nishapur, which was 4 times the size of Gorgan, 4% went to Egypt and Syria. I thought, why was 2%? Why would it be 25 times more likely that a person from Gorgan would go traveling to Syria and Egypt, where they could learn Hadith from scholars there, whereas those in Nishapur would travel, but not to Egypt and Syria. And I think that the reason is that the ones from Gorgan, that's an older trade that is coming and is known as the Silk Road. And Gorgan was a huge producer of silk. And I think that trade has continued from hundreds of years before Islam. But the Southern Road, the primary product being carried is cotton, which is a new industry under Islam in Iran. Yeah, I guess I've nattered on long enough about these various things. Not very organized, but hey, I'm 85 years old. What do you expect? So I'm going to stop here and be happy to listen to comments from Lucinda.
Lucinda is making a comment. I'll step down.
Yeah.
So, again, I am Professor Lucinda Mosher. My field here is interreligious studies. I'm also an affiliate of the Macdonald Center. I specialize in Christian Muslim comparative theology. My association with the Macdonald Center began in 1990 when I embarked on MA studies here at the school we now call HIU. I recall Bijlefeld lectures of previous decades with great fondness. Always the presentation by an esteemed guest was stimulating. So of course I looked forward to it. However, I also came eager to hear what an affiliate of the Macdonald Center would have to say in response. Professor David Kerr was masterful at offering a thought-provoking extemporaneous summary of and commentary on a brilliant presentation. Extemporaneous analysis is not my forte, but I am humbled and honored to be here tonight to respond in my own fashion to a brilliant presentation by a scholar with whom I once had the privilege and delight to collaborate. In the early 2000s, I worked in New York City as a consultant on multi-religious concerns. In 2007, Richard Bulliet asked me to help Columbia University's Middle East Institute plan an international conference on Islam in Turkey today. I was given much responsibility for schedule design and recruitment of panelists, and in the end, I did some of the moderating and presenting as well. It was a wonderful opportunity for me, and I have always treasured it. I know Richard Bulliet to be a consummate storyteller. You've gotten a sample of that skill tonight. Narrative is a powerful teaching tool. Narrative ethicist James William McClendon has asserted something that I often quote. He said, "There's an inherent complexity to the Christian moral life, not safely to be disregarded by anyone wishing to get the story straight." To adapt that turn of phrase to my purpose at this moment, what Professor Bulliet has shown us tonight is that there's an inherent complexity to the development of Islamic literature, not safely to be disregarded by anyone wishing to get that story straight. We see this in his remarks on the processes and concerns behind the development of Islam's Hadith collections on the one hand and early Christian literature on the other, in his explanation of the 2 dimensions of early Islamic sacred travel, Hajj on the one hand, and travel for the purpose of seeking knowledge, which could result in Hadith collecting. And in his lesson on the relation between geography and the production of biographical literature and Hadith collections, and in his explanation of the relation between Islamic sacred travel and caravan trading. Indeed, one thing I hope you will take away from this evening is that in lessons from Richard Bulliet, it is often the case that camels will figure in the complexity being explored. I particularly enjoyed what Professor Bulliet had to say this evening about pilgrimage and caravanning. A pilgrimage, it has been said, is a deliberate journey with potential for self-discovery, self-transformation, or deep engagement with the divine. Anthropologist Edith Turner speaks of pilgrimage as something that ordinary people do. She calls it kinetic ritual. Pilgrims walk, they view, they chant. How might you look at this topic? Scholarship on pilgrimage may employ any of several methodologies, after all. Pilgrimage itself is the source of many marvelous stories. So too have caravans. And that brings me to my closing thought, which is this. I hope that you have found Richard Bulliet's observations and stories he has told us this evening to be intriguing. I hope they have raised fresh questions for you and have suggested new directions for your further reading or listening. Professor Bulliet, please accept my deep thanks, which I am certain my Macdonald Center colleagues join me in conveying for the insightful and inspiring evening you have given us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mosher, for that response. And it always comes back to camels, right? Thank you. Right, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll now open it up for questions from the floor and hopefully some intriguing answers. Before we do that, I just want to say once again, thank you. And your talk underlines for me something that I find important when we talk about religion and religious traditions, and that is always the thousands of unnamed people that we don't know about who made these journeys and how important they are in the life of all religious traditions. So thank you very much for that. Okay, let's open it up for questions from the floor. We have microphones here, so.
Thank you very much for that very provocative and informative talk. But I wondered whether literacy had anything to do with this, and if so, how. What I'm thinking is that the camel traders were largely illiterate, whereas the Christians had access to literacy that the Muslims at that point did not. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I would say that that caravan trading is the probably primary source of the spread of Arabic as a written language from, say, Morocco to Indonesia. It's one thing about when you learn Arabic, just study it the way that I did when it was, a century ago, when you only learned it as a classical language. We weren't told how to speak anything. The one thing that became clear is that a book hand, just an ordinary handwritten book, you can read it from almost any area. But you look at book hands in medieval Europe, and you can say, well, okay, that's from such and such a monastery scriptorium, and this one looks entirely different, and this is in Carolingian minuscule, and this is in, and you have all these paleographic manuals on how to read Christian writings that I first encountered in graduate school. We took a seminar with Giles Constable on 11th century history in Europe, and the idea that anyone could read all of these scripts, we know the skill of the paleographers and the bibliographers that we have in our manuscript collections, but an Arabic bookhand simply isn't that hard to read. even though it's centuries apart and thousands of miles away. We do have difficult hands. Not so much in Arabic as in Persian, in my experience, or in or specialized scripts like Siakat Schrift in Ottoman or Shakeste in Persian. But the basic Arabic writing is pretty much solid from Timbuktu to Calcutta. And so I think that the literacy, it isn't a matter of what percentage of the population can read. It's all the question of what is the access, how broad is the access that the writing has. And I think that when you had travel for the search of hadith, the people traveling had to be literate, and they had to be literate in Arabic. And I don't think Christianity beats about. Matter of fact, I doubt that many of the Christian pilgrims were highly literate. A lot of the ones we read about are people who were knight of the knightly class, not a well-known, group of book readers. And so I think that this is that travel is a very important part of the story of the Arabic language and of Arabic literature. It's by the 10th century, it's clear that in Arabic literature, there is a growing interest in things that happen associated with with caravan routes and associated with skullduggery or conniving things. And these are the stories that populate the maqamat literature from Hamathani and Hariri and people like that, but is best witnessed in the Qasida of the Banu Sasan of Abu Dulaf al-Khazraji. And what it is, it's about a traveling guild of confidence men, thieves, performers, and lowlife. And they were called the Banu Sasan, and they traveled and they brought their confidence games from city to city, and the content of those confidence games provided the content for what become the sort of paradigmatic, novels about scoundrels that travel from place to place. It's I should mention that this group of the traveling common folk of questionable morals has been written about, particularly in the last 5 years, by Christina Richardson, whose book on the history of the Romani people is I think a masterful historical work, and she identifies the Romani people who used to be called gypsies, and even now the word Romani is very questionable. She thinks that the indigenous word is actually outsider, but she didn't want to write a book about outsiders because nobody would know what it was about, because everyone else is an insider. But she's done a marvelous job of bringing light to this group, so that when you had a merchant who was traveling, the merchant was exposed not simply to other people of his class, and it's almost always his. You just don't have women traveling independently. And they're pretty much cloistered on a camel saddle if they do travel independently. But it's not, these people did not just have exposure to their fellow literate merchant travelers. But they had exposure to swindlers and con men and performers and camel pullers and tent erectors and cooks and so forth. It's a society that curiously has produced no literature and no vocabulary. When we think of sea travel in almost every language that shares in sea travel is full of stories. But you don't have stories about caravans. And yet, that was the economic life for hundreds of years. We don't know what language they communicated in. My personal feeling is that New Persian, the language we call Farsi, is actually a caravan language, and that it had already begun before the rise of Islam, and that the purpose of it was to allow the burgeoning caravan trade of Iran, going from province to province, to have a commercial koine, a commercial trade language that would be understood by everyone because it was so simple. Whereas the other Middle Persian languages were much more complex. So I think that it's possible that this also goes into the spread of Bahasa in Southeast Asia. And I think it'd be interesting to explore. That may have been more by sea, but these commercial jargon languages, these linguae francae, I call them a lingua caravana. That it's the trade that builds the context in which language becomes simplified and extended over broader geographical areas in terms of understandability.
If I could offer just a quick anecdote for the next question about your point about the Arabic. Professor Kamali and myself had the opportunity yesterday to take some of our Indonesian students to the Beinecke Library in Yale. And we had a wonderful exhibit of different texts and manuscripts. And it was interesting. We had some Arabic, some Quranic texts and other Arabic texts from India, Iraq, Maghreb, and another place, Turkey, these Arabic manuscripts. And it was interesting to see them parse out the Arabic in each of these different places. So to your point about here are these Arabic texts from all over then the known world that our students were able to kind of read. So Arabic traveled.
Well, in 1970, I think 70 or 71, I was at Persepolis for the first time in Iran. I was traveling by myself at the time. And looking at, at Persepolis, you have graffiti left by generations of travelers and so forth, messing up the walls. And but there was one place, and I saw a man, or actually, I think I was there first, and it was a Bulliet inscription from the 10th century. And I was doping it out, and this gentleman came over, and he looked at it, and we were sort of sharing, reading through it together. And that very formal 10th century Arabic script was something that we shared an interest in coming from. And I found that he was from Pakistan, and he was the Director General of CENTO at that time, I think. And but you bond over reading Arabic stuff. I don't know whether Christians bond over reading the Lindisfarne Gospels or something like that. But so many experiences where you read together or you dope out together something that's impenetrable. If anyone wants an example of an impenetrable script that they can look at, they can read my novel, The Sufi Fiddle, which is about a 7-line inscription in a language that nobody knows.
I am buying that book tomorrow.
So I have a question for both of you. Dr. Bulliet is maintaining that the purpose of the travel is, if I understand correctly, in Islam, it's important to travel to get the truth, to get it from as direct a source as possible. But in Christianity, there were basically the apostles, and people read that. But is there an equivalent interest in travel in Christianity? And why did he pointed out, I'm an art historian, and I see pictures in my head of the Sermon on the Mount. Do we know anything that people thought there that were common people?
Yeah, there's travel in Christianity, and its purpose is a little different. It tends to be trying to walk the walk that Jesus walked, or to visit sacred sites for the purpose of drawing Godward. So there's this. It's not so much for the seeking of knowledge, but for the experience of place. And so what we see is when people cannot travel physically to Jerusalem or to whatever they had in mind, they would create it at home. So there are examples of pilgrimage activities, pilgrimage sites that are trying to recreate the experience that you would have had if you could have afforded to go farther. And in fact, the labyrinth that we have behind one of our buildings here is an example of pilgrimage in place, where if you cannot go on a pilgrimage that takes you far off, you can create a spiritual pilgrimage by walking the labyrinth, which walks you into the center and back out again. And you pass other pilgrims on the way, and you don't step on each other, you just pass.
That's interesting. I never thought about labyrinth. I mean, on purpose.
There are even songs, like the song Jerusalem that is an example of poetry expressing pilgrimage and then being sung. So thanks for the question.
Last question?
Oh, thank you. I just reminded of the saying in Arabic, trust in God, but tie your camel, when I was listening to you talk, and also how the word for beauty in Arabic has a similar, comes from the same root as the word for camel, although I don't know if that's a coincidence. Jamal and Jamila, and anyways, that's just an aside. My question actually builds off Dr. Mosher's, which is, you said that for people that couldn't travel, there's such a thing as a labyrinth, and you mentioned Dr. Christina Richardson, and she's written about the experience of marginalized people that weren't of means, and I think maybe it's reasonable to say that to both be able to learn Arabic and to travel to Mecca required means. So Islam as a religion, in my understanding, does typically make allowances for all sorts of scenarios, like if the water's dirty, like things like this, or if you don't have any halal meat, it's okay to eat what's in front of you. So are there allowances for people who weren't able to travel, disabled people, poor people, to sort of gain this status? Or was that something that became a sort of class status in a sense in the medieval Islam, or classical Islam?
Well, everyone's supposed to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, of course, and there were whole caravans full of cadavers where people intended to be buried in Mecca, Medina, and they would rent someone a camel and take the corpse with them to be buried there. The provisions for women traveling were very specific, where you had camel saddles that totally enclosed the female person. The lack of knowledge is disturbing. I mean, when you think of everything you have in the Canterbury Tales and how little, by comparison, we have, and yet we don't know why. I think that one of the reasons is that peril, that traveling by water is dangerous. Boats sink. Piracy is endemic. The Romans and the Chinese were continually concerned for hundreds of years trying to suppress piracy. Every sea lane in the world is littered with wrecked boats on the floor of the sea. But you never really read about a camel caravan carrying goods that never comes back. They don't sink.
They don't sink into the desert.
They don't sink into the desert. There are a couple of mysterious caravans that are military caravans that we don't know about. But by and large, it's a lot safer. I think this also led to lower insurance rates. We don't know much about insurance rates, but insurance rates are very important for long distance travel. As exchange rates, the same thing. And but you could probably, as a handicapped person or a social isolate of some sort, you probably do better on a caravan than you would seafaring, where people either had to pay their way or they had to work their way. And if you couldn't do either one of those two, your way was not their way. And so the economic side of it is, again, not really explored. It's interesting that if you want to read about life on a camel caravan, you have almost no books written using indigenous languages of the caravan world to have a personal experience. But Europeans write about being on caravans all the time. They find it fascinating. Probably the desert road to Turkestan by Owen Lattimore is one of the best descriptions you'll ever get of travel by caravan. But we don't get it in indigenous language, or those languages haven't yet, or those texts have not yet been discovered and explored, which I think is entirely possible. I don't think that well, let me just finish one thing I didn't mention. Before the year 1000, in other words, when Islam was already almost 400 years old, before the year 1000, not many people made the pilgrimage to Mecca. And there's a reason for that. There's nothing to eat in Mecca. There's nothing to drink in Mecca. There's no water, there's no agriculture. And the idea of having large numbers of people going to Mecca and staying in Mecca for some period of time is post-1200 for the most part. Because if you read Ibn al-Jubayr, one of the first people who talk about the pilgrimage to Mecca, it was not a built-up city. And the food had to be brought in. So people who would come, they would stay for the 10 days or so they need to perform the rituals, and then they have to leave. There's no place to stay. But if you go up to 1300 or 1400, you have Sufi brotherhoods have set up dwelling, basically hospices for fellow Sufis who come in. You have madrasas that have been built. You have it become more and more common, particularly for the most distant pilgrims, to come to Mecca and stay for 2 or 3 or 4 years. Now, this is a transformative moment for Indonesian Islam, which had a highly, somewhat eccentric local forms until you had the first long-term Meccan residents, Indonesians who had gone to Mecca and stayed and become a member of Sufi Brotherhood, usually the Qadiriyah, and who had learned Hadith there and learned law there, and then they come back to Indonesia and the religion changes when they get back. This is the work of Asyumardi Azra, who really wrote most about this. He was one of my students, I'm happy to say, and passed away a couple of years ago. It's very sad. But before, in the early period, there just wasn't that much pilgrimage to Mecca. Of the Abbasid caliphs, Harun al-Rashid went to Mecca, but I'm not sure if any of the others did. It somehow, my notion on this is that before 1200, the center of Islam was Khilafah, the caliphs, whether they had any power or not. That was the ideological center of the world Muslim community of the Ummah. After 1300, the center of Islam becomes Hajj. And the people who are ruling have control of the pilgrimage centers in Mecca and Medina are granted centrality politically in the Muslim world because of their being the servants of the two holy places. And that really starts with Salahuddin after the conquest of Jerusalem, who becomes the first person since the Umayyads to really control Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina on a regular basis. And I wrote about this a number of years ago. I think I have the speech on YouTube. It was in Denver. They published a paper on small writing on it that I did. But I think that right down to modern times, the Hajj becomes the center of Islam, and also it's after that. Before 1200, pretty much no one uses the title Hajj or Haji. It's after that. You get it starting, I think, with Ibn Battuta, really. There are a few examples before then. But by and large, even people who spend years living in Mecca and have gone on pilgrimage numerous times, they do not use the title Haji, or El Hajj. And then that comes in and becomes a very, very important marker, particularly in India and Southeast Asia and in East Africa, I think, and then oddly enough, you get the Christians starting to use the term Haji, which, and it shows up in compound names like of Greek Orthodox people like Haji Athanasiou or Haji Demetriou, where you have a name with the title Haji before it becoming a surname in Greek. And this is because they made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem as Christians. And but you don't get that medieval. This is early modern. And then you also start to get Hajj certificates, which are printed. Some are handwritten, some are printed, but they're printed things that you can take home and show people that say, I went on Hajj.
Oh, they really did it.
But in Christianity, they have Hajj tokens, where you have a little picture of a camel, probably.
Get the camel in there. So. Thank you so much.
So you mentioned camels, which I expected, but you also mentioned insurance, which I did not expect. But given that we are in Hartford, it makes a lot of sense. So would you please thank Professor Bulliet, Dr. Mosher, response. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.